First of all, before anything else, we would like to put on record condolences, deep condolences on the passing away of Prime Minister's mother, who was touching 100, making century. And I'm sure she must have inculcated a lot of values, sanskaras, and Prime Minister, which have stood him good stead. Now, I welcome all the friends here and also some friends who have joined from abroad, and we will have a very good session. Ravi doesn't need any introduction, but for the benefit of those who might not know, Ravi was born in London, brought up in Calcutta. And he's master's at Harvard University. And in this young age of 40, he has been a veteran of TV journalism. He spent 11 years at CNN, joined 2006. He was bureau chief in Delhi, 14 to 17. And he has been a senior producer of the CNN's popular World Affair program, which is hosted by Fareed Zakaria, called GPS. And he was a member of the team which was nominated for Emmy Award for 2012. And I didn't know that until 2016, he was a young global shaper with the World Economic Forum. And again, 2006, he was given Asia Young Leader Award by Asia Society. So what I will do is I will mute all of you, and except by invited, then you really unmute yourself, and certainly Ravi will unmute when his number comes. And then he joined Foreign Policy 2018 as the managing editor, then became editor-chief 2020, November, I think. And his book called India Connect, How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Biggest Democracy, has received rave reviews. I read that Foreign Financial Times called it timely and absorbing, hard to put down. News statement called it smart, sympathetic, and highly readable. He's blessed with very sharp mind, incisive analysis, and deep understanding. Above all, I admire him for his balanced view, because there are many intellectuals who go 180 degrees. Either you are really black and white. No, it tries to be more balanced and nuanced, which is a great quality. And I'm sure we will have a great discussion. Ravi, as you are sitting in US, as Bing Crosby would have sung, let us begin from the beginning. Now, how has been 2022 for USA? President Biden's party has done far better than people expected in the midterm poll. Economy grew in 2022 by 1.9%. It's not bad from American standard. Unemployment rate is still low. And thanks to the crisis in Ukraine, I find that, look, he has brought USA closer to NATO, closer to EU. And some cynical view is that USA has been a very big beneficiary of Ukraine crisis. The American export of oil, gas, and weapons have gone up. Dollar is riding high. As you know, Indian currency has really depreciated a lot against dollar, though it has not depreciated against other currencies. And then you see downside is that Afghanistan is in mess. You see with the Saudi Arabia have Tasnad, what kind of cold shoulder reception you see by the prince who is now prime minister there. And if you see in contrast the reception given to President Xi Jinping to China is a really very, so it's a mixed bag. I don't know what you say. What's your take?
Well, so Ambassador Kumar, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all of you for joining. It's always a pleasure to speak to this group. So I think, there were many questions within that question, but I think if you broadly look at Biden's 22 in terms of domestic policy and foreign policy, we separate the two of them for a second. On domestic policy, I think Biden is ending the year on a high. I think there's very little doubt that over the course of the year, the expectations here in the United States were that Biden, like most presidents, most incumbents in their first midterm election, that he would face a shellacking, and he didn't. And there are many reasons, and pundits have all kinds of analysis as to what happened there. But at least one theory is that the Republicans were dragged down by Trump. Trump declaring that he will win, that he will run for the 24 election. In some senses, also represents a favorable matchup potentially for Biden. So, as far as domestic concerns go over the last couple of months, Biden ends on a high. Inflation, the projections seem to be that they will manage to rein it in to some degree over the next 9 to 12 months. If America dips into a formal recession, then it'll be able to jump out of it fairly quickly. Those at least seem to be the predictions, in part because of the strength and power of the Fed, the strength of the dollar, which has held very well in the global economy over the last 50 odd years. The Inflation Reduction Act, interestingly enough, has been a real boon to the Biden administration. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but in many ways, it's a huge investment in climate technology and in climate subsidies. I was at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh recently, and I can't tell you just how excited the private sector is, not just in America, but globally, about the opportunities for investing in green technology in America. That's certainly something that I think holds the Biden administration in good stead. And if I just jump from here to foreign policy, and I know there's so much to uncover and unpack. Interestingly enough, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is unpopular for European countries, for example, which have all said that this forms unfair competition of sorts, that American subsidies hurt European countries from competing. Macron was recently in the US for a state visit, and he made that complaint formally. The reality is that, bring it on. I think the way the Americans see this is that competition is a good thing. Europe probably needs to match America on similar subsidies for green industry. Outside of that, so many things to look at, and I'm sure we will over the next hour. But on Ukraine, I think the big concern going into 2023 is whether the Republicans will continue to support, excuse me, will continue to support Ukraine as they take over the House in January. All signs currently point to, some friction, but then broadly continuing the Biden agenda of supporting Zelensky as much as possible. I think Zelensky's visit to Congress last week really helped. It was a very popular visit, and he spent a lot of time with politicians here. I would keep an eye on how the far right, Tucker Carlson on Fox News and others of his ilk have, been questioning Zelensky, have been questioning the merits of continuing support to Ukraine. I would keep an eye on that because Fox is often a good way of looking at what might come down the pike for Republicans, what they're incentivized to follow in the future. And then outside of that, Ambassador, you mentioned Afghanistan. It's a mess. Afghanistan is a complete mess. China, I'm sure we'll discuss China in much more detail this hour, but I'm worried about how much US opinion has coalesced around seeing China as a threat, not just as a challenge, but as a threat. That sort of, it used to be that the Republicans were the hawks, and now even the Democrats have such hawkish sentiments about China that there are real fears here of, escalatory rhetoric of the recent semiconductor bans on China, for example, which are the toughest sanctions on China we've seen. All of that could have ripple effects in terms of decoupling, in terms of more tensions, in terms of maybe even triggering something in Taiwan. So all of that is stuff that deeply worries, I think, many of us in America.
Okay, I will again unmute all of you. Ravi can unmute himself because I find quite a few persons have not really unmuted. Okay, Ravi, now we will turn to India. Now it become almost cliche that India-US relations have never been better. And there is some justification. The number of exchanges, EM meet, foreign secretary, defense secretaries meet, finance minister meet, prime minister, president meet. Virtually they meet in person, then 2+2, and all kind of statement come from how highly US really rates India's importance for the Indo-Pacific, for the Quad, now I2, U2, you name it, or even climate change. The other side is that, look, on trade, we have nowhere anywhere near the trade agreement that has been discussed from Boer time to Trump time. Now we are all still there. Then you have GPS is not going to be restored. There are frustrating long delays in the visa, which are really creating a lot of problems for those who are working or H1 visa. And then you have differences with Iran, difference of Russia, difference of UK, difference of Afghanistan, and even Pakistan. But we have recently, must have noted now, we have a kind of government here, and especially very articulate EM, who in the American soil can tell the American journalists, look, what you buy in one afternoon is what India buys in one. Now is the situation of these, but India has found Russia is now the largest oil exporter to India in the last 2-3 months. But thing is that now we have reached a maturity where the US and India can have differences, and it's still accommodate each other. So India can buy S-400, India can get Russian oil, cheap oil, and it's still US will find worthwhile to really have India on side. So do you think everything is hunky-dory with India-US relations? I think you wrote an article sometime back called India has a mindset problem. Over to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're right to say that it is a cliche to call the India-US relationship better than it's ever been, but there's truth to that. I mean, just recently I was in Washington and I met some senior US officials who deal with India and Asia in their portfolios. And it was just so clear to me that they are animated about India taking over the G20. They are excited to do more business with India, to engage with India in various ways. One thing that is, I think a real feat of Indian diplomacy is that there used to be a time when America would make quite clear to everyone that it's my way or the highway. And in India's case, there's a real sense of that tone and that rhetoric won't work with India. Rightly or wrongly, America sees India as a country with its own interests. For example, with the issue of importing Russian oil. I remember even about a decade ago when America was sanctioning Iran, and it expected India to follow along, the tone was very different from what we see now with Russia, where it's much more respectful. As you point out, I mean, Indian oil imports, I think, have grown from 1% to 20% in terms of Russia's contribution to the total crude supply. If it were any other country, I imagine America would be much tougher, would be punitive in some ways, but it doesn't use that kind of language with India anymore. Why is a good question to ask. And I think, again, the way to understand American foreign policy today is to see China as the overriding concern for American policymakers. Even when they think about Ukraine and Russia, they're thinking about China. When they think about how they must respond to Russia, they're thinking about how to prevent China from attacking Taiwan. And where does India fit into this? I think India, in the American sensibility, is a country that America needs to ally with. It needs to have on side. America would much rather India was even closer when it came to the Quad and other forms of sort of semi-military partnerships. America would much rather that India only bought American arms, for example. America would love to wean India off of historically Soviet military hardware. So America needs this relationship to be closer, not just for business reasons, but as a longer term bulwark against China. I think what's interesting is how India maneuvers that. I think as tensions between India and China ebb and flow, after all, the Chinese, the recent sort of scuffle on the border between India and China, it's interesting to see how that plays out in India. It's interesting to see whether things get much worse next year, if China becomes more aggressive, what impact that'll have on how closely India wants to ally with America in the longer term. So I think Americans are very strategic. They want to ally with India. But if you look at the shift in tone over the last decade, over the last 20 years, it's based in realism. And that realism is that they need India, but they also intend to use India.
Well, you might recollect recently a book was released at the Carnegie Endowment. Our friend Ashley Tellis was interviewing our EM Dr. Jaishankar. And he mentioned one of the problems of we talk about allies, one of the problem in USA that USA partnership and alliance is considered synonymous. India, it is not. In India, partnership is different from alliance. In the USA, they think partnership alliance are one same thing, which is not. That is why even when the Chinese pressure comes and a lot of people say, look, you strike an alliance or form an ally of USA, I don't know whether it will sell in India. The perception of alliance is totally different in India. And another thing which I would like to ask you have written a book about how smartphone has changed the Indian democracy. What about writing a book about how Modi Jadoo Ki Jhappi has changed the conduct of diplomacy? After all, he used saying with Obama, there's nothing common with Obama and Trump. There's nothing common with Trump and Biden. And Prime Minister Modi has unique ability of strike a very personal chemistry, warm chemistry. And this must have contributed great deal in improving relations.
It must have. There's very little doubt that he has exhibited a way of connecting with other leaders in a way that not only works in the media and how it's picked up in terms of perceptions, body language, the Jadoo Ki Jhappi, and all of that, but also in terms of how he connects with leaders. I think there's little doubt that that works, has worked, has served him well. But all of that said, I think, Indian diplomacy in general has become more muscular over the last decade. And I think that's a factor of India's size. It's a factor of slowing growth around the world. I think if you look at 2022 and you look at the growth rates of various countries around the world, India is looking pretty good. 7.7 odd percent growth compared to, less than 4% for most other large economies, or negative in some cases in Europe. You want to do business with India. You want to be closer to India. You want your companies to be able to get into India, for now at least. But I'd caution as well that India shouldn't rest on its laurels. I think for India, the growth imperative is for its people, not for its standing in the world. Another way of looking at it is that India still has a lot of growth to do in terms of supporting its people, in terms of uplifting people out of poverty, in terms of improving infrastructure. And so all of those things, I think, remain important for the Indian economy.
Well, now let us turn to China. For almost 2 decades, Chinese economy was growing at double digit. There was a lot of commentary that China has already overtaken the GDP of the US on PP basis or about to take, but then came Donald Trump. And the tariff war really shook Chinese economy. Then came COVID. Now we come to a stage where this year, according to the RAM report, Chinese economy grew in 2022 only 3.2%. Next year, some of our friends IMF tell it will grow only 1.6%. It has enormous economic problems internally. Now, do you think this economic decline, steep decline, what kind of repercussions it can have domestically and its external policies?
Well, we've already seen some of the impact. I think a lot of people see COVID purely from a health lens. I think we also need to see it through an economic lens. So Over the last year, research now suggests that lockdowns and the zero COVID policy represented a 2 percentage point drag on the economy. So when you look at now the protests that broke out in November, which were unprecedented, basically the biggest protests since Tiananmen Square in 1989, not only that, the first time since 1989 that people questioned not only a policy, but also questioned the leader himself. So in that sense, these protests were really important and the biggest of its type since 1989. You look at why they came out to protest. Part of it, obviously, is they're sick of lockdowns. They're sick of the zero COVID policy. But a deeper analysis would also show that they are worried about where the economy is headed. 3.2% growth is not the social contract that the Chinese people signed with their leadership. If you look at the last 20, 30 years of China's growth, it's unprecedented in the history of the world that a country would grow at close to 10% or more for that long. And in a sense, I think since the time of Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese people have this unsaid acceptance that they will take less freedom for faster growth. That worked for the better part of 3 decades. But as China now enters this era of slowing growth, COVID, which has caused a steeper slowdown than you would expect, is more repugnant, is a bigger problem. And this is something they will blame Xi Jinping for. So in that sense, I think the last year has just given us some indications of cracks in the edifice of China's growth model. I think there are many academics, many China watchers who now have begun to think that China might have peaked, that the question of China overtaking America may be one that was premature, that was purely looking at trend lines, and the trend lines have now changed. I think there's merit to that argument if you look at A, slowing Chinese growth, B, China's demographic challenges, which don't look set to improve anytime soon despite relaxing the one-child policy. C, you look at real problems and flaws within the Chinese economy, a completely bloated real estate sector, heavy indebtedness. You put this all together and there are real concerns about how China is going to manage its growth in the future and what this means for its leadership. One thing I will say, however, anyone who's imagining that Xi Jinping will fall or that this government can't deal with protest really doesn't understand how China's changed in the last few years. China is a complete surveillance state. Anyone who you saw protesting a month ago, you will not see again. They're gone. They are locked up somewhere. China has the ability to, with AI, with its surveillance technology, it's able to pinpoint, identify every single protester and make sure that they are punished. It's very hard to imagine that there will be significant major protests in 2023. Every time there are protests, they'll lock people away. And I think more broadly, the Chinese people understand that. They understand how much Xi Jinping has consolidated power. But also, we mustn't forget that some polls suggest that, the Chinese people are behind Xi Jinping. So we mustn't rush to condemn China, to condemn its model. It's worked for them so far. I think there are just cracks in the edifice. And I think most of all, what we need to adapt is our sense of where the trend lines are headed. They're not headed as fast upwards as we thought they were. It's just slowing down.
President Biden has openly said China, Russia are USA's strategic rivals. Now, if you analyze last 2 years, the USA has not really been able to rein in China or Russia. China, in spite of all these problems, all effort of decoupling the American economy with Chinese economy has not succeeded. If you look at the figure of Chinese export to USA, they have not gone down drastically. Not many American companies have pulled out of China. Finding the alternative source, reliable supply chains have really not materialized too many, very few. Recently, President Biden attended the American ASEAN Summit, American East Asia Summit. If you look at the mood there, None of the countries is prepared to stand with USA against China. China still has largest trading partner status for more than nearly 100 countries. This is kind of investment they are making in the country, even around India. The Chinese have not really been able to checkmate it. Actually, the Biden policies have brought Russia and China nearer, which was not the objective. How do you see this playing out, that really countering, out-competing China in economic terms, or out-competing China, really asserting influence internationally?
Yeah, there are a great set of questions there. On the issue of America bringing China and Russia together, closer together, I think the jury's out on that in 2023. I think Xi Jinping is a bit embarrassed of how badly Russia has performed in this war so far. I think, were Russia to have more of a setback, then China will not hesitate to, I think, pull back even further from Russia on that sense. So the jury's out. I think we need to see which way the war heads in 2023. And we don't know which way it's going to head. But on the issue of decoupling, I think there have been a lot of big changes over the last few months, and it's important to unpack those. You're right that on the one hand, most of the global south, the countries of the global south, they don't want a US-China Cold War. They want to do business both with America and with China. Almost every country on earth, every reasonably sized economy on earth will count both China and America as among its top 5 trading partners. So it's very hard to imagine that they would want that to change. That makes it harder for America to decouple. However, that said, if you look at the latest semiconductor sanctions on China, they are just unprecedented in their strength, in their scale, in how stringent they are in terms of punishing any company, any country that allows China to access advanced computing. So basically, if you don't know what semiconductors are, they are, the components that go into any high-end computing. So fridge, microwave, but more importantly, PCs, mobile phones, TVs, anything that requires high-end computing. By curtailing China's access to these semiconductors, it has the effect of really damaging China's ability to compete on the global market. And this will impact the world in ways that it hasn't begun to understand. So next year, TVs might become 20% more expensive. Your smartphones might become more expensive. And if you think that other countries can't or won't follow along with these sanctions, we're wrong. I mean, that's how strong America is. It has the ability to implement its sanctions and to compel companies especially, but also countries to comply. If they don't comply, there are very punitive measures that get taken in terms of cutting off companies from the dollar system. So these sanctions are really going to end up biting deep down into the supply chain in 2023. The question is how China will respond to that and how much it's going to hurt China, whether it's going to try and develop its own capabilities, which will take decades. Remember, this is not just physical capital, it's also human capital. It takes a while to develop those kinds of things. More likely, China will strike back in some fashion. So, I think America's approach towards China has gotten dramatically tougher in the last few months. As I said at the start, this is an area that worries me immensely because it makes it unpredictable. It makes it more likely that China could lash out in various ways. And it makes the entire global system more fragile. However, this is the path America has chosen. There is bipartisan consensus that treating China as a strategic threat, not just competitor, is the way to go. And we're going to see more such measures, I think.
No, you are right on semiconductor, really damaging, hurting China. But sanctions alone are not really instrumental in producing results you want. Take case of Ukraine. All the sanctions are against Russia. have not been able to cripple the way USA might have thought, because they are escape routes. One side put a sanctions, other side country will keep on doing business. And Europe certainly many countries must be really feeling exasperated. They are paying the price for the decisions which are made in USA, especially winter time. Look at how many countries are really shivering in cold. Now, do you think the stage may come where many European countries might like to drift away and do business? Look at recently we have the German chancellor in China. He was really having cozy conversations with Xi Jinping and how much business can be generated. But do you think more and more countries can find that this continuation of sanctions thanks to American policies, when there is no real game plan visible? What is the end game of USA in Ukraine? How do you want to put this to end? They might find a stage may come, they cannot continue to support this kind of proxy war.
Yeah, Ambassador, that's a superb question. I'd like to recommend to this group a couple of books to look at. There's a new book called Backfire by Agathe Desmarais. She works at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and it's a terrific book on how the history of US sanctions and how they do not tend to work. And there's another great book that came out at the start of this year by Nicholas Mulder, who's a real expert on the history of US sanctions as well. I forget the name of the book, but Mulder is Mulder, in case you're looking for it online.
Thank you.
I think so the semiconductor sanctions, I think, are different. They are unique in that they laser focus target one particular sector. And I think they do it very well. I think they do it in a way that will actually hurt China. But on the broader issue of whether American sanctions work, the jury is totally out. I mean, with Iran, how have sanctions really stopped Iran from getting closer to a nuclear bomb? One would argue Iran is closer than it's ever been, and the maximum pressure era, the sanctions era, they have completely backfired with Iran. On Russia, the jury's out as well. I think I recently interviewed Wally Adeyemo, who is a deputy US Treasury Secretary and essentially one of the men behind designing the sanctions on Russia. He would argue that the sanctions are dynamic. They tend to target individuals. They tend to be escalatory. The sanctions, they actually always reserve some firepower. So you often wonder, why every 2 weeks am I hearing about new sanctions on Russia? Why don't they just do it all in one go? And the reason is that A, they want to hold back some firepower, but B, as they learn new things, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. So they sanction X number of oligarchs and billionaires. They see the funds move in a certain direction, so they add some new sanctions a few weeks later. Or they'll sanction, a top civil servant's daughter or something like that. They're dynamic. They are hurting, clearly. The question is how much of that pain on Putin, which is real, how much of that translates into pain for the people? The jury is out on that. I think Putin has shown that he can sustain a lot of pain. He has shown that he is not entirely rational all the time. This is not a rational war. So it's very hard to combat it with rational means. And I think that's why the jury is out on sanctions as well. But, one way of looking at why these sanctions could ultimately work in a geostrategic sense, not in a sense of stopping the war in Ukraine, but in a geostrategic sense. If you are a national security advisor in America, you will look at 2022 as the year that Russia peaked. Basically, the Russian economy will likely never look the same again. I mean, it's fair to imagine that year on year, Russia's economy will shrink by 4 to 5% a year, maybe more. Russia's will never essentially be the same player on the global stage, given the damage to its military, given the damage to its economy, given the human flight of capital we've seen over the last few months. In that sense, you mentioned that Biden sees Russia as a strategic rival. Well, it's a greatly weakened strategic rival. And in the years to come, will be less of a rival. So in that sense, maybe the sanctions have worked. I think it depends on the parameters of success and what America is looking to do. But anyway, it's an issue of immense debate here in the US, and there are lots of books and interesting articles on the issue.
Do you have a clue what is US's endgame in Ukraine? How they wish to end it? Prime Minister Modi did make that great statement, this is not era of war, and everybody applauded it. And but Putin said, yes, he took note of that. What happened? Later on, he held some referendum, he annexed those parts, and bombing going on, missiles are still firing. So there seems to be no clarity on the American part or the ally. What do you want? You continue giving more weapons, you continue giving more money. So great fighters of Ukraine will continue to fight. They are great fighters. And Russia will also not leave. Stop it. So how long can it go on? There are suggestions of Prime Minister Modi can play a mediator role. How much? Because we have a leader who commands respect, who has got relations with USA, with Russia, with Ukraine, Europe, everybody. But we don't have any very direct, crucial leverage against Russia or against Ukraine.
Personally, I don't think India will end up playing a role, in large part because I don't think Ukraine will want to use India as a mediator. I think Ukraine essentially will say it doesn't want any mediators at all. It doesn't want to have talks with Russia. That's the official line. And Ukraine can say that because it sees itself in the ascendancy. That might change. I think at some point next year, if Ukraine is weaker, as the war ebbs and flows, Ukraine might be more willing to seek out a peace agreement. I don't see India playing much of a role there, in part because of its role so far. And look, many other leaders have tried. Macron in France, even the last Prime Minister of Israel, Bennett, many others have tried to flit between Moscow and Kiev and provide some form of diplomacy. And it hasn't really worked, in part because no one really knows what Putin wants. And Ukraine's mindset has also changed as it has made more advances on the battlefield. But I think the broader question of what is America's endgame is the most important one to have, because without America's direct involvement here, this war would have turned out very differently. So let me flip your question. What does America want? Look at the counterfactual. If America doesn't support Ukraine, what happens? I mean, that would be basically Russia taking over vast parts of Ukraine. There are signs that it may want to launch another attack on major cities at some point. It hasn't given up. It would mean, the breakdown of democracy in Ukraine. It would mean the violation of sovereignty. It would mean a significant defeat for NATO. It would have significant repercussions for Europe, for the EU. But also more broadly, it would mean that China would have the nerve to maybe take action in Taiwan. So, the flip side of everything you're saying is America cannot afford to not support Ukraine. And that's sort of the prevailing view in Washington. It's a prevailing bipartisan view, I would say, even with the changes in Congress that are coming up. So I don't expect America to swerve from its game plan anytime soon. It's very expensive to keep sending arms to Ukraine, but of course it also helps America's domestic arms manufacturing industry, which can replenish some of the munitions and weapon systems that America is sending to Ukraine. So in that sense, there are parts of the American infrastructure that benefit from what's going on. So I think the American end goal would be pretty much as it has been saying quite publicly for a while now, which is to keep supporting Ukraine, to not force a settlement, to allow Ukrainians to determine their own future. Any talk of a peace deal to be led by the Ukrainians themselves. My sense is that that will be the line that American policymakers will continue to follow.
Let us move to some other part. What has happened? Why American-Saudi relations have become so sour? Because after all, Saudi Arabia has been one of the strongest allies USA for more than 2 decades. And the states come there first. Biden didn't want to go there because prince was supposed to have been involved in the assassination of Khashoggi in Turkey, but then he had to go, and he did go there. But then the way he was received was not something very sort of respectful for the U.S. president. And now you see, to show the contrast, he unfold the red carpet for Chinese president. He holds Saudi summit, Arab League summit, Gulf summit that promises 78 to 76 billion dollar investment. So things have really gone totally differently than what Americans have been expecting.
Yeah, I mean, Saudi Arabia has long been the place where American values and interests have collided. It is both predictable in that sense, but also unpredictable in that, you know, Biden expended an immense amount of political capital by going to shake hands with that famous shot of him fist bumping MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. It cost Biden a lot domestically to do that, to be seen to be doing that. And what America wanted in return, of course, was for Saudi to agree or to allow OPEC to pump more oil, which would then reduce global oil prices, which would be beneficial for America at home. That didn't happen as planned. And or it happened to a degree, but not in the way that America was hoping for. I think if you look back over the last 15, 20 years, it shouldn't be that surprising. I mean, Saudi has increasingly done what it wants to do. I think America has always, you know, struggled to balance its sort of distaste with Saudi domestic policy and Saudi human rights records, with its need for Saudi's help on the global markets. I think what's exceptional, though, is this year, in that if it weren't for the war in Ukraine, if it weren't for the immense pressure we're seeing on the energy markets, America wouldn't need Saudi as much as it did this year. So this year is exceptional. I think the broader trend lines in the future will continue along the trajectory we've imagined, which is that America will need Saudi less and less. And again, as I said, its primary focus will be China, competition with China. I think Saudi knows that. And that's why Saudi is getting closer to China as well. It's strategic. The entire world can see what is coming with a sort of burgeoning US-China Cold War, and they are preparing accordingly.
Now let's move to Iran. Please share your thoughts. This regime is literally facing existential crisis, or the women's protests are just little blip as you see from time to time. But this time they seem to be much bolder, taking more risks, and really coming out openly. So can you really see what's going on? Because sanctions have been there for so long, but suddenly you find a stage where women power, as India says, Nari Shakti is coming to the forefront and challenging this regime, which has been against all the women.
Yeah. So you know how I said earlier that don't expect massive protests in China next year? And I was sort of explaining how China has this incredible, unparalleled ability to crack down on protests using technology and also the repression of the state. Iran doesn't have the same technological ability to identify protesters, to crack down on protest. Its society also is quite different than China's society. I think their social contract with the Ayatollah's regime and the elected president is a different social contract than the one that the Chinese people have struck with their leadership. I think this year's protests, which began as a protest over the enforcement of the wearing of hijab or headscarves, and has now turned into a much broader protest against the rule of not just Raisi, the president, but more specifically the Ayatollah. I think this level of sustained protest, which now is bigger than the 2009 Green Movement, shows no sign of abating. I think the recent Iranian decision to have the morality police step back, I think that's a minor concession. I don't think the protesters are taking it seriously. So I think we're heading towards a collision in 2023. It's a fool's errand to predict what exactly is going to happen. I think the regime will continue to crack down where it can. But one thing to keep an eye on is that there have been several rumors. I stress these are only rumors this year about the health of Ayatollah Khamenei. If something were to happen to him, then that would trigger a power struggle, not only to replace him, but would also further threaten the legitimacy of the regime, would further intensify any protest movements, and would lead to great instability at the very least. So that is something to keep an eye on. One last thing on Iran, the Iran nuclear deal, America has largely failed to try and renegotiate and re-enter the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. It's likely to stay that way for quite a while. I don't think Iran sees it in its advantage to jump back in on current terms. I think they're distracted partly by these protests. I think they're looking very closely at what's happening in Israel with an extremely hardline right-wing regime now in power. And they're assessing the global situation. So the current sanctions will continue, but Iran has gotten increasingly good at evading them.
Can you now please give an overview, broad overview? General impression is US is losing out to China in Africa. Even South Asia, you leave out Asia, if you leave out India, in Bangladesh, you take Nepal, you take Sri Lanka, take Maldives, and if you get African countries, they have some problem of BRI, I mean, that traps some country, but overall, still, they seem to be losing out to Chinese influence, Chinese investment, Chinese business.
That's true on some metrics, but not all of them. I think there's little doubt that over the last 20 years, China has mobilized financing through the state for African countries in a way that was no strings attached. Well, let me clarify that. There were strings attached in terms of debt, which they've been very quick to recoup when they need to. But there were no human rights strings attached. There were no IMF development strings attached. There were no moral strings attached. And so Africa, in that sense, has looked to China as a ready, easy source of investment, which could be more palatable in some senses. All of that said, there are many sectors in Africa that have seen what Chinese assistance can look like, what it means in the future, how onerous some of the debt terms can be. And so they're looking at America. They're also playing both sides against each other. So there was a big US-Africa summit just a couple of weeks ago in Washington. Many African heads of state came to America and appealed, not just for aid, but for partnerships not just with the state, but company-to-company partnerships in Africa. There were lots of agreements signed. There were lots of incentives put in place for companies to come and develop in Africa, to invest in Africa. So, I would say that it's game on in terms of competition, but also we must fully expect, parallel to what I said earlier, for Africa to play America and China against each other and to seek out the best deal. And why not?
Well, general impression is that Quad, Indo-Pacific, these are groupings which are really putting some sense in China to abide by international law, play by the rules. But China, Russia think these are specifically meant to stall China's rise. They are anti-China per se. This perception has really not been changed because China and Russia think these are deliberately created just to stall China. Now, you talk about Taiwan. Many countries believe that Taiwan issue is really put to heighten hype just because of the so many actions. Like Pelosi went to Taiwan. Did it help anybody? It didn't help Taiwan, didn't help interest of Taiwan. You create a exciting storm and teacup, and there's no long-term strategy. Now, I don't know how far Indo-Pacific or Quad will be able to really checkmate China. What are your views?
Yeah, the jury's out on that. I mean, with Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, it was purely for domestic political reasons. It was unnecessary by many counts. It backfired in some senses, really leading to a souring of US-China relationships for quite a while. So that was unfortunate in a sense. But at the same time, America must be seen to be supporting human rights around the world, and so it has that imperative. On the Quad and other such alliances, I think the Quad would never call it as such, but I think it's fair to say America sees it as, if not an anti-China alliance, then a bulwark against China. And you can't really fault the Chinese for the perception they have of the Quad. Whether it really makes a difference, that's hard to tell. I think, in as much as it increases cooperation, intelligence sharing, potentially even military to military exchanges and sharing, the more that happens, the more of a bulwark, the more of a stronger bulwark you have against China. So in that sense, China looks at it quite warily. And I suspect that is part of the American imperative here, to build alliances that would stand ready to be a bulwark against China.
Then what are your views about globalization? Is it really receding? Because you can see China supposed to be advocate of globalization because they have benefited from it. India has benefited from it. But during last 2 years of COVID, many people feel that globalization is not bad. Countries are now trying to have bilateralism, trilateralism, or the regional grouping rather than the globalization. What are your thoughts?
I think we've been in a period of deglobalization for several years now. I think the growth in global trade has reversed to some extent. I think also because of COVID, supply chain restructuring is underway on a range of industries. I think for many businesses that are thinking about resilience in an era of climate change, in an era of potentially more disruptions to supply chains, they're going to think more in terms of localization, local supply chains, local resilience. In an era of nationalism, they're going to think more about growing supply chains within their own countries in terms of boosting domestic production, domestic manufacturing. So I think for all of those reasons, we are seeing, after a 4 or 5 decade period of pretty much rampant globalization, we're now seeing a bit of a reversal of that trend. I don't think it's a permanent reversal. Some would see it as a bit of a correction of sorts. But that's mostly in terms of physical goods. I mean, if in the digital world, nothing stops globalization. I think if you think of virtual reality or AI or the online world, we are more globalized than we've ever been, and it will ever be thus as more people get connected to the internet, as younger people come online. In some senses, we are more globalized than we've ever been. So I don't think it's the worst thing in the world for companies, especially, to think about localizing supply chains so that they're more resilient in the future. In that sense, COVID is just a dress rehearsal. I mean, if there are massive climate change impacted breakages in the current global trading system, it's worthwhile for companies to think about more local supply chains.
Well, Ravi, we have covered a lot, and I admire your frankness, candor, straightforward manner. You have answered all the questions. Now, let me shoot at you one hypothetical question to pick up your brains. If you were Prime Minister of India today, what initiatives you will take to warm up relations with China and Pakistan?
Wow, that's a tough one. Gosh, I mean, if it were that easy, right? With China, I think, look, the border crisis is a problem. India, of course, has tried to speak to China, and that isn't an easy thing to do. I think for starters, increasing high-level diplomacy with the Chinese would be a very good step. It's been, over the course of the pandemic, diplomacy has been very difficult. Xi Jinping hasn't traveled much until the last 2 or 3 months. I think I would invite Xi Jinping to come to India to visit, and to use that as an excuse to see where the two countries can cooperate. Even as, of course, America would frown on that.
Mood in India is not for welcoming Xi Jinping at this time. What happened just a few weeks back?
Yeah, you're probably right on that. This is why I will never be a politician. Pakistan is much harder. It's much harder to see how to. There's also so much instability, I think, in Pakistan. It's hard to know who exactly you're dealing with. It's hard to see, with elections coming up next year, what kind of leadership they'll have. We don't even know if Imran Khan will be allowed to run or not. Very difficult to project forward what's going to happen there.
Well, our agreement was you will give me 75 minutes. So I want to spare about another 15-20 minutes to have some questions. We have friend here. I think I will invite your colleague, Swasini Haider. Swasini, are you there? Yes, Swasini, what is your question?
I'm here. Just one sec. Let me put this video on.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you for that real masterclass really on where ties are right now, Ravi. And, everything you said really paints a picture for us to look forward to in 2023. So I wanted to ask something which may seem almost trivial in comparison to, our conversations about how nations deal with each other. And that is, what do you think is really holding up? And we know the real reasons, over Eric Garcetti's nomination, getting into trouble with the Republicans. But at the same time, close to 24 or 36 now, as of last week, ambassadors have been confirmed. The administration has put their names forward. And yet we find this situation where, while we have remarkably good ties, some say the best of them, we're actually in a situation where India has not had a US ambassador here for the longest such period. So I wanted to get a sense from you of what's going to happen, because we know that they have not brought it up. Congress has gone into recess, I think, as of 2 days ago, and or as of this week. And that means that the whole nomination is going to have to go all over again when Congress is convened on January 3rd. So how do you see that progressing? Is the Biden administration going to relent and just send a career diplomat, which I think the Republicans have indicated they'd be happier with? And a small added point, the Congress ended this session without what many had hoped would come through in the session with Ro Khanna's amendment in the NDAA, which was a waiver for sanctions against India under the CATSA ruling. Do you think that's deliberate? And do you think India has still got hopes that there would be a waiver in the next Congress, given that now we're looking at a House that the Republicans will be have a leg up in?
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, Suhasini, you know these issues as well as I do, or better, I would say. On Eric Garcetti, I'm sure all of you have heard the rumors about, one of his staffers and allegations about their behavior. I have no inside information as to what actually happened there, how it's holding up his nomination. I mean, there's little doubt that this is just a tragedy of, that this relationship has, on the one hand strengthened, and on the other hand, we've gone 2 years without an Indian ambassador in the US. I would just say it is not just India. There are many countries that America...
US ambassador in India.
Yes, sorry, thanks for correcting me. I think that
Okay.
there are many countries that do not have American ambassadors right now. This has been a real embarrassment for America. It's an inability to confirm ambassadorships. All of this said, I'm not sure how well known this is or how much it gets talked about in India, but the American system of ambassadorships is totally broken. In most countries in the world, you have career diplomats people who rise up in the IFS and whatever and become, you have various postings around the world, and then you get more and more plum assignments. In America, that happens with some countries, but with the biggest ones, you basically, you are able to, if you donate enough money to a party or support the presidential candidate in the right way, you're able to sort of win an ambassadorship at the end of it. It's a broken system. It's a broken system that invites partisanship. It's a broken system that invites the kind of gridlock that we're seeing now on Garcetti's appointment. And so, on the one hand, I'm sure Democrats want to blame Republicans for not letting them confirm his nomination. But on the other hand, I mean, this is a system that was broken by both sides for decades. I don't have any intelligence, Suhasini, on what might happen next year. My suspicion is we may see a career diplomat. Also on Katsa, I have no inside intelligence to offer you, other than to say that I think it's even less likely under a Republican-led Congress.
I see raise hand.
Just to jump in, I shouldn't say it with so many esteemed ambassadors over here, but if we go a little longer without an American ambassador here, people might start wondering, do we really need it? The relationship seems to be going just fine.
No, they have appointed and retired ambassador CDA, Miss Elizabeth Jones are here. Now, Sujan, do you want to ask some question? DG of IDSA. Question, not comments.
No, I have no, thank you. No desire to make a comment. I mean, it's his show, really.
Yeah.
A nice talk. Thank you, Ravi. I sense that you hinted that you would like to see India and China talk to each other a little more, and Xi Jinping might visit India and gauge the situation, etc. On the other hand, there is, and I'm asking you a question, I get the sense from my interactions with Americans and Europeans that there's a growing sense of unease that what if India and China were to press some kind of a reset button, what then would happen? And everything that you recognize as the known framework, current framework of cooperation would come cascading down. Do you share the same kind of anxiety? And if you think there is some reset possible, what is that reset? A second part of this question is pertaining to the securitization of the Quad. You referred to the Quad perhaps inadvertently, but as an alliance, and that it is a semi-military thing. At least the Americans see it that way. Is the securitization all about simply India sending a few more destroyers and an aircraft carrier to visit the Pacific, or is it also about America changing its maps to show India's geography correctly? I'd like to refer you to a piece that I wrote 2.5 years ago on the cartographic route to strategic partnerships. The United States doesn't show Aksai Chin as a part of India. It shows it as disputed. And worse still, Japan and Australia show Aksai Chin as a part of China. Now, how can we securitize the Quad? Is the Quad only about the maritime issues, or is it about each country's perceptions of China? Ours take us to the continental side as well. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
Ravi.
That's a great question. My suspicion is that America would try to sort of let the UN take the lead on that and sort of follow its path on cartographical matters. I think it's also interesting to see what the private sector does there. I mean, if you were to use Google in America, you actually get a different set of imagery than you would as you would search in India. So, it's very hard for countries to do what companies can do with geo-targeted searches, showing one thing in one place and another thing in another. I think, one reason why we won't see, a greater securitization or a hard securitization of the Quad is because that then allows China to openly call it a military alliance or to call it an anti-Chinese alliance. And so hence the hedging around that, the obfuscation around that. I think that benefits Quad members to not be seen as openly hostile to China. But all of that is going to continue coming to a head in the coming years. I mean, imagine if China did attack Taiwan. What would America call on its friends to do? Imagine what America's response would be and what that would mean for an Australia or a Japan or an India. I think those are all questions that, you know, policymakers in those countries have to think about more. So, you know, the next few years in that sense are extremely worrying. I mean, as I said earlier, it's almost crazy to see how much American both public perception and political perception towards China has changed. I can't emphasize this enough. People who were seen as you know, right of the center or as hawkish even 5 years ago, today would be considered to be doves. That's how much the mood has changed. The anti-China mood here has changed. I think everything that America does with other countries around the world is through that lens, through that larger, longer-term strategic lens of what it means for China.
Let me invite my friend Rajiv Bharti. I didn't see his face earlier. Rajiv was earlier DG ICW. He was also our High Commissioner in South Africa. Rajiv, please go ahead.
Thank you, Surendra. Ravi, thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear you once again. We all stand to benefit. I have a question about only one sentence that you devoted to G20. You are a keen India watcher. You have seen how India is excited about the presidency of G20. And for the past 2 months, we hear and read nothing else in the Indian media about G20. So my two questions are, one, is this excitement and widening interest in the Indian circles reflected in American media to some extent or not? And secondly, how does the US look at India's key priorities for the presidency, one of which is reformed multilateralism? So when India this year probably tries to bring in the reform of Security Council and the rest of it, how will US react? Because we know that probably China will oppose it.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, there is absolutely zero American media interest in the G20. This is not because of India. It was the same with Indonesia. I think if you were to, you know, poll the American public, if they knew who's holding the presidency of the G20, you know, I mean, it would be less than 0.1% of people would have any idea. So it's not a media story. In general, you know, foreign news gets covered very little in the American media. When it does, it's usually just giant issues like the war in Ukraine or the Queen's death or something to do with China. On the policymaking side, however, I think there's immense interest among US policymakers about India taking over the G20. I think there's already a lot of high-level engagement. You know, I've already seen in DC, very senior White House officials have been very receptive to outreach from various Indian groups such as USIBC to meet and discuss and listen to various stakeholders and see what India wants to try and propose and how to engage with India in a very serious way. Security Council reform, however, is the toughest thing. I mean, in part because the veto system exists, you essentially veto off any reform. So it's very hard to see how that actually moves forward, especially given that, you know, these are 5 powers that don't often agree with each other. So I think even if America were to sort of come out more loudly in support, it's hard to see the needle moving on that.
Well, I had time just for one more question. I had Professor Chintamani Mahapatra. I think are you there? I think he's left. But we have another professor from JNU, Professor Nonika Datta. Are you there? Professor Datta. You want to ask a question? No. I will turn to my neighbor, Mr. Ambassador KP Fabian. Ambassador Fabian, last word, last question. Unmute yourself. You are on mute. And Mr. Fabian, unmute yourself first. I think he is not able to unmute himself. Professor Datta, do you want to ask anything?
No, I'm fine. Thank you for this wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, Ravi, thank you so much. You have been so kind to spare your time when you are so busy with so many things. And as usual, you have really proved once again, you have your finger on all the developments in the world. And I'm sure day after tomorrow, or day after on third, you are going to discuss the worst crisis in the world and how to solve them. And I am sure some of the thoughts which will come out will also include crisis around us, because around India, we have not touched about what happened in Sri Lanka. It was on disaster. President had run away from the country. What is happening in Pakistan? We don't know what will happen there. Look at their whole game plan. Afghanistan is going haywire. Afghanistan is not under the control. They are not driving seat. They are getting their own people killed by the people coming from Afghanistan. In Bangladesh, I mean, there our neighbor relations are very good, improved during Prime Minister Modi. But look, the kind of massive investment which China has done in Bangladesh, amazing. Anyway, I wish you, your family, your foreign policy magazine, a very, very successful year ahead. And we hope to see you physically in Delhi. When you come next time, please do let me know. I'm very happy to host you for a lecture or maybe some kind of business luncheon. Thank you so much. Best of 23. To all of you who have taken trouble of joining us. Okay, bye-bye.